The privatisation of public transport services and agencies always proves to be a contentious topic. But I have noticed there can be a few misconceptions about what public transport privatisation actually involves and how it works. Now, I'll say it from the start, I'm no fan of privatisation, but I think to oppose it properly, you need to oppose it for the right reasons. So in this video, I want to look at what it actually means to privatise a mass transit system, as well as what it doesn't mean. I also want to see what benefits privatisation can bring, as well as of course the drawbacks, to then hopefully understand if privatising public transport can ever really be worth it. Mass transit and privatisation have a long history together. In fact, the very first mass transit systems were built and operated by for-profit companies. The Metropolitan line on the London Underground, the very first underground railway line in the world, got its name because it was built by the private Metropolitan Railway Company. Which is interestingly how the word metro being used to describe mass transit systems came about, but that's starting to get a little bit off topic. The point is, many mass transit systems got their start with private businesses. This is true for many of the underground lines in London, the New York City subway, and even many of the railway lines in Australia. To name one example, the Sandringham line in Melbourne that got its start under the St Kilda and Brighton Railway Company. This is because, back in the day, without the competition from cars, there was a lot of money to be made in the railway business. But as time went by, and particularly after World War II, profitability started to fall, and many of these businesses were bought up by governments and taken under public ownership. This was all well and good, but then in the mid to late 20th century, cars really were becoming the dominant form of transport across the world, and public transport use was dropping. If we look at passenger numbers on Sydney's train network, for example, we can see the numbers growing steadily until the 1950s, where they then begin to drop and plateau as travellers moved towards cars. It wasn't until as recently as the mid-2000s that Sydney saw its train ridership return to the same level that it was in the 1950s, although now it has grown massively since then. This led to, and also was caused by, governments shifting their spending towards car infrastructure, and as a result, public transport systems, particularly in the West, began to fall into disrepair, further reducing ridership. These systems became deeply underfunded, underutilized, and were generally often growing more and more unpleasant to use. So, people started looking for solutions, and while many advocated for more government funding, some took the view that, given the government was not doing a particularly good job at running these public transport systems, that they might be better off in private hands. And in the late 20th century, with neoliberal governments gaining power, privatisation was all the rage. While many systems escaped it and have remained in government hands, many others didn't, including examples such as bus services across the United Kingdom, basically all of Melbourne's public transport, and even some more successful examples like the privatisation of Tokyo's metro in the 1980s. Now, at this point in the video, I think it's worth talking about what it actually means for a public transport service to be privatised. And it's worth noting that I am coming at this topic from an Australian perspective, so it can work differently in other countries in some cases. To simplify the process a bit, when a government wants to privatise a service, they usually do it through a process of tendering, where various private companies might bid to operate the service. The bids will offer to run the service at different price points, allowing the government to choose the bid they think will be best for the service. Now, when the prospect of privatisation comes up, I see a lot of people protesting it with signs like this. They'll warn of things like fewer routes, fewer bus stops, higher ticket prices, and sometimes less frequent service. But I think it's worth calling out that, at least within the typical Australian context, these just really aren't very accurate. As part of the tendering process, the government will say something along the lines of, "We need a company to run these specific routes stopping at these specific stops in line with this specific timetable." The private businesses then bid based on those conditions. They don't get a say in changing the routes, changing the timetables, setting ticket prices, or deciding where the stops will be. These things are still typically managed and decided by the public transport agency, like PTV in Melbourne or Transperth in Perth. This can differ internationally. In the UK, for example, the private companies operating National Rail do have some control over ticket pricing and scheduling. And there, these private companies can often cause controversy by cutting services, like was recently the case with trains that run between Manchester and London. What the private operator is in charge of varies, but at least within Australia it typically includes maintaining the vehicles, employing staff like drivers or station ground crew, the actual day-to-day running of the various routes, and other customer service related activities. So then, if the private businesses don't really get much of a say in how the system gets run, why do we privatise in the first place, if the government still basically gets to set out what the service will look like? Well, if you talk to proponents of privatisation, their arguments will often look something like this. Firstly, the tendering process I mentioned before means various companies will be bidding to operate the service, allowing the government to pick the best priced bid and ultimately save money for the taxpayer. These private businesses will also be motivated to keep operating costs as low as possible in order to achieve the winning bid. Whereas these proponents believe that when the services are operated publicly, no such incentive to lower operating costs exists. The government also usually ties the achievement of certain targets to financial incentives. For instance, in Melbourne, the private operator of the train network must achieve a punctuality goal of 92% each month. And when Metro failed to meet that target in August last year, they were forced to give commuters a day of free travel. So, given failing to meet these targets can directly impact the bottom line of these businesses, the belief is that they will have a significant financial incentive to achieve them, and that just wouldn't be the case for a publicly run system. Now that all sounds pretty good, but then what about the bad side of privatisation? I mentioned the view that privatisation can save money, but you can easily turn that on its head. A public operator theoretically just needs to cover the cost of running the service, but a private operator needs to cover that cost, plus then make a profit on top of it. So a proportion of the cost of running these services privately must always be devoted to private profits. There's also quite significant upfront costs when a service is privatised, or when it shifts hands from one private owner to another. The new private owner might need to undertake new training for existing staff, invest in rebranding various aspects of the service, lease new office space, and all the other small things that might need to change when your route is now suddenly operated by a new business. The cost of which wouldn't exist if the system had simply remained in public hands. And speaking of branding, introducing a bunch of private operators into the mix can create brand inconsistency and, of course, redundancy. For example, if I want to plan a journey on a tram route in Melbourne, should I go to the website of the state-run Public Transport Victoria or the private operator of the tram network, Yarra Trams? Well, the answer is PTV, but that's not necessarily immediately clear. And what about if I want to check a tram route timetable? Well, I can actually do that on both websites, but that means money has had to be spent on two separate occasions to build a timetable feature for two different websites, which seems a bit wasteful. But for me, one of the biggest issues privatisation can cause is that its contracts can prevent the government making changes to services that need them. For example, in New South Wales, the state government is currently locked in multi-billion-dollar contracts with private bus operators until the 2030s. And these contracts will be a major roadblock if the government wants to undertake some much-needed bus route reform. If these routes were operated publicly, the government would have much more room to move quickly and amend services as they need to. So, privatisation, like so many things, has its good points and its bad ones, but do these actually mean anything in the real world? Well, there have been various attempts to measure this. For example, a study into the effects of the privatisation of bus services in the United States found that while it did effectively lower costs, these savings came mostly from reducing staff pay, and the privatisation of routes ultimately resulted in lower service quality and safety. On the other hand, when the UK privatised its national rail routes, it did see significant increases in customer satisfaction ratings in the years following, as well as significant growth in ridership. That said, there's also evidence that UK rail privatisation led to a reduction in service punctuality. A more recent study from Shanghai, where various bus routes had their privatisation reversed, found that this reversal resulted in significant performance improvements. And coming back to Australia for a very recent example, despite the New South Wales government's insistence that the 2018 privatisation of buses in Sydney's inner west would help fix ongoing issues, the actual result was the opposite of that. with performance dropping under the new private owner. So there is, I think, a fair bit of doubt as to whether privatisation can actually achieve what it promises. And given there's usually strong opposition to it when it's proposed, why do politicians keep going ahead with it? Well, I think these decisions can often be ideologically led rather than based on hard evidence. And of course, there are sometimes more morally ambiguous reasons for why it can happen, but I'll let you discuss those in the comments. That said, private involvement in public transport doesn't have to be a bad thing. In Florida, a private company, Brightline, has opened a substantial new rail service in the state that probably wouldn't be there otherwise, with plans to expand its service to other parts of the US. And a great way transit agencies can reduce the costs of expensive projects is to incorporate private commercial and residential developments when constructing new lines or stations. Ultimately, privatisation has a long history with mass transit, for both good and bad. But governments who think it will be a fix-all solution to their transit woes are mistaken. It's just as likely these problems can be solved through a public system with better funding, without needing to give up significant control and flexibility in how the system operates. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Privatisation is still very much a contentious topic, and I'd like to hear your opinions on what kind of place, if any, it has in our public transport systems. As always, if you liked this video and would like to see more like it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I'm City Moose, thanks for watching.